Hey everybody, welcome back and thank you again for joining me. This week we're going over killing your darlings, the importance of it and how to do it. Way back when I first started to write in the early 2010s, this terminology of killing your darlings actually was a bit misunderstood. For a lot of authors, including myself way back then, the idea of killing your darlings tended to mean more about killing off of characters. A lot of this was because Game of Thrones was a very popular TV show at the time, and George R. R. Martin had talked about the idea that when he had first started writing Game of Thrones, he wanted to kill his darlings, that he wanted to basically keep these characters, the stakes for the characters pretty high, and he actually used the terminology killing your darlings. This translated to a lot of newbie writers like myself, basically misunderstanding what that meant and thinking that you had to kill off characters. You had to keep the stakes real for your characters. And unfortunately, that's not really what it meant. And I think, at least nowadays, the terminology has been corrected quite a bit. So what is killing your darlings? Killing your darlings is not a story device, but actually a means of approaching your drafts with the intent to remove unnecessary elements from it. Generally structural issues, characters, or in my case, often prose. It's cutting out the parts of your story that you really, really like, but you know just simply is not working. It's a bit like a roster cut on a sports team. The overall team must come before the individual player. And so when there is an individual player that's hurting the team, you have to get rid of them. And often with our drafts, what happens is what works for our stories initially. When we first plan out our stories, when we first draft it, when we go through maybe second or third drafts, what tends to work then versus what works later on is not always the same. Stories change as you write them. And so as the story evolves and as the elements of the story that you really want to focus on change, other parts of your story must be cut out. It's unfortunate, but it is a very necessary aspect of the process, hence why they call it killing a darling. You're not removing the parts that you like, you're removing the parts that need to be removed. So that brings up the question, how does one know when it's time to kill off a darling? A good way of knowing it is to look back at your story, and when you start to realize that what may have worked for an early draft simply is not working now. There's no hard and fast rule on this. A lot of it just comes down to intuition and really comes down to you as an author and what your level of experience with recognizing what makes a good story and what doesn't. But a general rule to follow is to look back at your later drafts of your story, and when you begin to realize that what you had initially intended with your story has changed, you need to start planting your flag one way or the other. Are you going to go with these new changes to your story and go with a new direction, or are you going to go with the old one? Often this feels like two different stories are competing for page space on your draft. And a good way of telling is actually critique partners. They're the first ones to kind of point out that, hey, the story's changed a bit. What you tried to tell early on in the story is not being addressed later on. Or how you've crafted the story initially, it's just evolved to a very different thing, and you haven't been able to really wrestle with this monstrosity yet. These are good general rules, but again, a lot of this does come down to more author instinct. Another good way to tell is if you are writing scenes to serve the darling rather than having the darling serve your scene. For example, you rewrite the same scene over and over and over again because you want to keep a couple really good lines of dialogue or a couple good lines of prose, but it's not actually serving the scene, and in fact, it's hampering it. Example, you might have written an initial draft where you had a good back and forth of bitter dialogue that presents your character as this really abrasive sort of maverick character. And you realize in later drafts that, no, in this scene, I need my character to be a lot more amiable. I need them to be a lot more friendly, a lot more cooperative with the person they're talking with. But you decide to keep those really good bits of gritty dialogue in the story because, man, that's just some really good dialogue I wrote. I have to keep it. Something like that needs to be addressed. That's a darling that needs to be killed. You are writing the scene with the darlings in mind. You are trying to keep them in there even though they're hampering the scene overall. The scene in the chapter that you're writing must come before the individual lines of prose. This is a very emotionally difficult choice, and that's just the nature of writing. Oftentimes in the writing process, the more emotionally difficult choice is usually the correct one. It is far easier to send off a half-finished story to an agent or an editor than to go through and do another 2 or 3 drafts to revise it. It is easier to keep a story that might be critiqued locked away in your drawer than to send it off one day to have other people look at it and potentially accept it for submission and also risk the rejection of it. Writing is all about emotionally difficult choices. It's the nature of the game. So how do we kill them off? For a lot of writers, incentive matters. And for more established published writers, the incentive is financial. They kill off darlings because agents or editors tell them to do it, and they get paid to do it. If they don't kill off the darling, the editor doesn't accept the work, you're not getting paid. Unfortunately, for most of us, myself included here, we're not getting paid yet. So how do we do it? The best way to do it is to adopt a professional mindset. When we first start off writing our stories, there's an expression about your first draft should be for you and your later draft should be for the public. And that's kind of true. You have to maintain a business mentality. There is an element of writing these stories where you have to recognize that this is not going to be your only work. You are writing this story to have it finished, so that way you can go and write the next one. And then hopefully over time you can amass a catalog of work. This sort of mentality makes cutting the darlings a little bit easier because you recognize that, yes, this line of prose I wrote, which was magnificent, will not be seen. But that's okay. I have another book in the future that I'm going to write that's going to be even better, that might even have that line of prose in it. I'm going to at some point be moving forward here, and this book is just kind of a link in that chain. This sort of detached thinking is paramount, really, to having that kind of professional mindset and being able to do this. Again, it's not easy, but understand this is pretty much just an emotional response. That's all it is. Hitting a delete key requires very little effort. It's the physical activity of this. It's not hard. It's the emotional part that we have, and the way to overcome that is to adopt more of a professional mindset. Now, with that out of the way, I do have some further considerations for you all. The first is that this is going to happen a lot to pantsers. If you pants your novel, if you write from the seat of your pants, if you just get up and kind of discover your story as you write it, this is going to lead to a lot of structural issues in your later drafts. It's very rare that you can pants a novel and get a really good second or third draft out of it without something of a bit of an overhaul applied to it. If you're crafting this as you go, you don't have the time to tinker with these ideas beforehand like someone that a plotter would do. And so you're going to end up with scenes that don't go anywhere. Characters that don't really serve your story need to be cut. Structural plot changes which just don't quite make sense and need to be retooled. All these are elements of pantsing, and if you enjoy that process and if you find it to be very helpful, awesome. But for a lot of us, I tend to discourage that because you're going to run into some of these problems as you go along. My second point is that critique partners are going to be invaluable assets to help you out. Critique partners are not always the best at giving you solutions, but they are amazing at pointing out mistakes. If something's not working, they can find out. And a little tip for those that deal with critique partners regularly, like myself, the advice that you get, the issue that is brought up, that you fight against the most, that you emotionally hate the most, right? That you just reject outright. That's probably the thing you need to change. Because more often than not, your rejection of that, the reason why you're clinging to that particular darling is you kind of know subconsciously that the critique partner is correct. You realize, yeah, their critique is valid and even, most cases, necessary. But you sort of thought, I like this darling. I'm going to let it try to see if I can get it under the radar. I'm going to see if maybe I can just let this thing crawl right under the fence there and have no one notice. And unfortunately, critique partners are really good at calling out your BS. And when they do, and you get called out on it, there's that response. So oftentimes, listen to that. Listen to the rejections. Listen to the issues that are brought up and the ones that you really fight against, because that's what needs to be corrected the most. Third thing, allow time to be your ally. As weeks, months, perhaps even years go by, you will become less attached to your work. It's just the nature of human psychology. As time goes on, our attachment to things tends to go away, especially our creative projects. And when that happens, the professional mindset, that sort of detached mindset, will take over and make it far easier to make these changes. It's a lot easier to come back to a draft you wrote 5 years after you penned the most recent version and go through and recognize the mistakes and decide to go through with it, rather than trying to kill off your darlings the day after you realize it. Because, boy, I spent so much time writing this and it just feels so good. I can't cut it out. I cannot possibly do it. Time removes that emotion. Time is a very helpful asset. And so I encourage you to perhaps trunk your novels for a while. Put these drafts in the drawer for a bit. And as time moves on, I think you'll start to notice that your ability to go back and make these changes is a lot less emotionally difficult. And finally, my last bit of advice is to remember who you're writing for. Most of us are writing for an audience. We write to be read. And so our work must serve them first. Or rather, our work should serve them ultimately. If you do have just one novel in you, if there's just this one novel that you just need to get out, that you don't plan to ever write anymore, and this is just your personal sort of self-gratifying novel, that's fine. In that case, killing off of darlings is going to be a lot more difficult, and perhaps I'd even argue maybe you don't need to do it. If you're writing purely for yourself, then who cares what anyone else thinks? Who cares what the reader might like about it or hate about it or find incorrect? If you're writing it just for yourself, it doesn't really matter. But I'm betting a lot of us, even those that have that perfect novel in their minds, are probably writing for others to read it. You're writing because you want others to see it. I don't think you're going to be a sort of J.D. Salinger type and just trunk every single novel you ever wrote and never let the world view it. I'm betting you're writing to have others view it. And so with that in mind, adopt the mentality that killing your darlings is a necessity to eventually telling a really good, strong, cohesive story. Well, that's it. So with that, I hope this was very helpful. Killing your darlings is, of course, not an easy thing at all. I'm actually going through that myself right now. I had to rewrite the first 3 chapters of a novel that I thought was basically done. And so it's never easy, but as time goes on and as you develop as a writer, it does become a bit less torturous. And so with that, if you've enjoyed the video, please give it a like. I will be back next week, and until then, I wish you all happy writing.